Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for another Midnight Mirage Classic. Very grateful to have you tuned in. So for this production, we will get a history lesson on modern geopolitical conflicts. And we will also get a lesson on modern European Christian warfare. All right. So this will be a lesson on geopolitics and religious warfare. All right. What we know, for the past couple of months, at some point, all of us have seen a news report giving us information concerning the war in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and Russia. All right. And by extension, the countries that are in allegiance, or the nations that are in allegiance with Ukraine, in particular, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, and other nations from Western Europe are also in affiliation with this war. So you have a certain sector of Western Europe and Western Christianity going against Eastern Europe or Russia and Orthodox Christianity. Okay. And in order for us to understand the current, relationship between these countries and, where did this conflict stem from? We will have to look into the past. We will have to look into medieval Europe, and we will have to look into the first couple of hundred years after the death of the Israelite leader during the time of Rome, in order to understand this modern conflict. Another question that we will ask ourselves is this: do all so-called Caucasian Europeans practice the same form of Christianity? We are familiar with the Catholic Church and the Protestants. We're also familiar with the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, and Orthodox Christianity. And although all Caucasian people may profess to be Christians, they come from different denominations and different sects of Christianity. And the same way how today you see, certain branches of Western Christianity not getting along with Eastern branches of Christianity, this is the same in the old world, or the ancient world, we'll say. And although today the Christian nations are being represented by individuals or men with pale faces, in the old world, the medieval period, in the first couple of hundred years after the death of so-called Christ or Yeshua, these were melanated faces representing Christendom that initiated some of these conflicts. Okay. So we're going to talk about a variety of things. We're going to talk about the, conflicts between Western European Christendom under the Pope and the Byzantine Empire of Orthodox Christianity. All right. That's ultimately what we're going to talk about, because in order for you to understand, why did these European nations, or the tribes of Europa, why were they influenced to come and set up colonies in the Americas? There were a lot of religious conflicts going on and a lot of upheaval going on in Europe during those times. So a lot of people were, trying to escape persecution and create a new life. But for those that have purchased my book, America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent, you will notice that I take a great deal of time in several chapters to elaborate and give detail on some of the history that was going on in Europe prior to these voyages of the Spaniards, or the Portuguese, or the Dutch, or the Britons coming into the Americas. Okay. So it's very important to understand the background landscape and the climate of Europe and what was going on in Europe. It's very important to understand that, so you'll, understand what was influencing and inspiring them when they came to the Americas, and understand that there were different forms of Europeans coming to the Americas that had different types of religion. And the people of America who are aboriginal or indigenous to the Americas, they usually will affiliate or associate themselves with the tribes of Europa that they could either have a same type of mentality, or maybe their culture could be reconciled or merged, or they could come to some type of agreement. Okay. But it wasn't like all the tribes of America were getting along with all the tribes of Europa. So there were a lot of civil wars and, internal conflicts going on in Christendom in Europe. And as I say, by the end of this tape, we hope to have a better understanding and have some enlightenment on this subject, because this will result in us, being able to perceive and understand the modern conflict between Western Europe, the United States, NATO, and Russia, because this actually is just the beginning of a series of conflicts that will unfold as the years go on. Okay. And, our children and our grandchildren will grow up in a world that will be severely affected by these wars. There will be economic consequences. There will be cultural consequences, etc. But us being here in present day 2020 can do our due diligence by just trying to have some understanding. Okay. So to give an introduction to this tape, we're going to have a variety of sources, and I will provide them as we examine them. But the first thing I want to do is read a certain part of a book I have called The Negro Question Part 3, The Black Pentecost by Lee Cummings. The Negro Question Part 3, The Black Pentecost by Lee Cummings. And we're going to read this introduction and go into our lesson. This is coming from page 132, chapter 8, called The Black Roman West. All right. I had to stop writing for at least 3 weeks to gather all of the evidence that I shall present before you today as proof that the western leg of the Holy Roman Empire was black, just like the eastern leg or the Byzantines. If the evidence that I present to you today is the truth, then that would mean that the whites have only been ruling Europe for the last 214 years. This would also mean that blacks colonized Europe for 1800 years. This modern historian's truth is based on the pen and nothing else. He cannot substantiate his version of history because he is missing that critical element, and that is the archaeology. The archaeology, ancient coins, ancient images, ancient letters, pottery, or grave sites, etc., gives the pen its credibility, not the other way around. The pen is nothing without the archaeology, just like a man is nothing without the breath of life or oxygen, and that is a fact. The archaeology can stand alone. If it hasn't been altered or tampered with, the pen is just subject to the artifacts, just like man is subject to the breath of life, that is law. So let's go forward. The western leg of the Holy Roman Empire lived on until 1800 AD, which means that the whites have only been ruling Europe and Arabia for the past 200 years. In this chapter, I want you to focus on 3 things: the artifacts, the testimony of the ancient historians, and the timeline. These 3 elements within the bowels of this chapter is what my case is built upon. So let's continue on. The Iberians are a brown complexioned people with curly hair. The Anthological Review, Volume 8, Anthropological Society of London. So what Lee Cummings is going to in chapter 8 of his book is he's making a case and proving to you that the Aboriginal people of not only Western Europe or Western Christendom and Eastern Europe or the Byzantine Orthodox Christian Empire, that both of these were founded and ran by a melanated people, or what we would call today so-called black people. And these people would be like a cousin ethnic group to indigenous Americans. Okay. Now, the man that you see on the screen is actually one of the original bishops, priests, clergymen during these time periods of the Byzantine Empire in the early 100s, 200s, 300s, 400s, 500s AD. So as I said, although today you may see the nations of Europe that practice Christendom, although you may see them as a Caucasian people, but originally they were so-called black people. This is why in the Orthodox Church, you find a lot of the melanated images of Yeshua, or the melanated images of Moses, the melanated images of Abraham, the melanated images of Solomon. A lot of these images can be seen in different museums of the so-called Middle East and so-called Eastern Europe, because the Orthodox Empire of the Byzantine Empire and all the nations connected to them, they were not subject to the Spanish Inquisition. So when Western Europe was starting to change their, culture of Christendom, And a lot of that change included manipulating the images of the heroes of Christendom that are in the Bible. The Eastern European church was not affected by this. So that's why a lot of those melanated images still exist, because they weren't, subject to the Spanish Inquisition and the Catholic Church basically trying to wipe out ancient history and create a new false history. Okay. So it says, I know that you are having a hard time digesting these images of a black Charlemagne, but once you research where he was born and who the original inhabitants of that land were, then you might be able to accept the truth. Charlemagne was born in Gaul. Gaul was the ancient name of France, and it was the black Iberians that colonized and lived in this region of the Roman Empire. Of particular interest is the coat of arms that Charlemagne displays on his shield. You would do well to pay close attention to the two black eagles, which represent the two black Caesars who ruled the Roman West and the Roman East. When the white Habsburgs took power in the 18th century, the two black eagles were replaced with two white eagles to emphasize, quote unquote, white power. The black Iberians were the original settlers of Spain, France, and Gaul. At the end of the image, I shall place a timeline date to show you that the black emperors, as we move through the timeline of life, Charlemagne was a black Iberian, plain and simple. So ultimately what Lee Cummins is making the point, and I'm basically going on the same point, is that the original indigenous people of Europa were a melanated people known as the Iberians. Okay, the Iberians. All right. Now, when he's talking about Charlemagne, he's talking about the king of France, or the king of the Franks in the 800s. Okay. Charlemagne from 742 to 814 was king of the Franks from 768 and emperor of the Romans from 800 to his death in 814. All right. And if you look up the original image of Charlemagne, you will see that he is a melanated man, and he's holding actually the scepter, and he's also holding the world ball of dominion. And also in his hand, he's holding, you would say, a shield with the dual eagles of the Holy Roman Empire facing the east and facing the west. So the first thing that you want to conclude with is understanding that there were melanated people ruling Rome, ruling Christendom in Eastern and Western Europe. All right. And that picture of Charlemagne, if I don't use it for the thumbnail, I'll show it in another tape. As a matter of fact, I have a video called Ancient Faces. And what I'll do is in the description or the comment section, I will put a link to my video that I have called Ancient Faces, where what I do is I show you these images of all the Aboriginal people of Europa and the Aboriginal people of what we call so-called the Middle East. All right. And you'll see that these were all a swarthy, melanated, copper-colored, earth tone group of people that originally created what we know of as Christendom, and that we know of as the Islamic Empire as well. All right. And also the original Hebraic people were melanated as well. Okay. So as I said, now we have an understanding of, where did Christianity come from? Who were the founders of Christendom? These were the melanated Iberians of Europa. These were the Germanic tribes of Europa who were also melanated that converted into Christianity or Christendom. All right. I talked about this before when we went over the Atlanteans, and I talked about the melanated Vikings of Europa and how they went into Western Europe, and there were a lot of wars and conflicts with the Saxons, with the Angles, etc. And a lot of this is actually documented in the Game of Thrones, also the House of Dragon. What else? They have a series on Netflix called Barbarians. But, this is where you'll get a history of that. Well, it'll show you the Roman Empire when it came into the, what we call the British Isles, and several parts of Europa, and how the Romans fought against the various Germanic tribes. All right. The Iberians. Now, you got to remember that the Roman Empire was amalgamated. So you had not only a melanated people in it, but you also had, let's say, a fair-skinned person in it as well. And up under these people, you have what's known as the Slavs or the serfs, who were, I guess you could say the servile class of these nobles and aristocrats of the Roman Empire. And this was the same in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. All right. So that is how the Caucasian was introduced into Christendom. He lived and served as a serf or a Slav under the Byzantine Empire and Eastern Christianity. And he served as a serf to the melanated nations of Christendom in Western Europe. All right. So when he began to come into prominence and civilize himself, he used Christendom or Christianity that the melanated Europeans around him were using to create a culture for himself. But he was not the original founder of it. All right. So now we want to turn our attention next to the First Council of Nicaea. So now we understand that there were melanated people ruling the Byzantine Empire. That was the capital was in Constantinople in Eastern Europe. But there was some conflicts already going on just a few hundred years after the death of Yeshua. All right. And some of these conflicts included, well, what kind of Christianity are we going to use? Are we going to try to create something that's pure? Or are we going to create a new form of religion that's going to include Mystery Babylon? Now, when I use that term Mystery Babylon, what I'm talking about is a form of religion where you include the ancient pagan ways of either, let's say, the Trinity or the virgin birth or the so-called Son of God or God being incarnate. These are actually ancient principles that date back to ancient Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, ancient Acadia, ancient Misr or Mizraim. These are ancient concepts, okay? So Christianity actually is not the first religion, or we'll say spiritual system, that used a trinity. Christianity is not the first spiritual system that had a so-called virgin birth, and Christianity is not the first spiritual system that included a, heroic figure that was said to be God incarnate or the Almighty Lord incarnate. Okay. So one of the problems is that, what are we going to do with this Christianity? Are we going to create something new, or are we going to include these ancient Babylonian principles? And this is what some of the, issues were in some of the debates and commentary that was behind the First Council of Nicaea. So what we would do is read about the basic, some basic information on the Council of Nicaea and tie that into what we've been talking about. Because remember, we still are going into the history of why does Western Christianity not get along with Eastern Christianity? Why is NATO and Ukraine and the United States and certain other Western European Christian nations, why do they seem to have these conflicts with Russia? Why do these Zionist Christians and the Zionist Jewish people, Caucasians of Western Europe, why do they seem to be going against Russia? All right. So let's read. This is some basic information coming off of Wikipedia, nothing too deep, just so we can get a brief overview of the situation. The First Council of Nicaea was a council of Christian bishops convened in the Bithynian city of Nicaea, now located in Turkey, by the Roman Emperor Constantine I in 325 AD. The council was the first effort to attain consensus in the church through an assembly representing all Christendom. Its main accomplishments were settlement of the Christological issue of the divine nature of the God, the Son, and his relationship to the Father, the construction of the first part of the Nicene Creed, mandating uniform observance of the date of Easter, and promulgation of early canon law. So these were some of the topics that were going to be discussed at the Nicene Council. And one of the main issues was, when it comes to God the Father and God the Son, what is the relationship? Are they equal? Is the Father greater than the Son, or is the Son on the same level as the Father? This was going to be some of the issues discussed at the Nicene Council. Okay. So the next thing that we want to do, now that we got an understanding that in 325 AD or through the 300s AD, You had, Christian bishops now coming together that were from the Catholic Church, from Eastern Orthodox Church, from the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Assyrian Church of the East, the Ancient Church of the East. You having these different churches of Christendom, these different Christians of Europa and the so-called Middle East that were going to try to come under one page so they could figure out how we're going to distribute Christianity, because, we all got to have the same story, basically. All right. Now, this is going to be some of the root of the problem. It says, now this is the last part that I want to get to before we continue, because this is very important right here. It says, one purpose of the council was to resolve disagreements arising from within the Church of Alexandria over the nature of Jesus in his relationship to the Father. In particular, whether the Son had been begotten by the Father from his own being, and therefore having no beginning, or else created out of nothing, and therefore having a beginning. Say Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius took the first position. The popular presbyter Arius, took the second. The council decided against Arians overwhelmingly. Of the estimated 250 to 318 attendees, all but two agreed to sign the creed, and these two, along with Arius, were banished to Illyria. So ultimately, what happened is this: at the Council of Nicaea, majority of the men there had the mindset that Jesus, or the so-called Son of God, was equal to the Father, meaning that he was God incarnate and he had the same principles and the same status and station as God the Father. That's what majority of the men in the Council of Nicaea were under the impression of. But then you had men like Arius of Libya or Alexandria, and he was under the impression, trying to stick to what the pure religion was really designed to be, is that that you have God the Father, or the Lord Most High, and then you have the Messiah or the prophet or the leader that is sent by God Most High, but he is not God Most High himself incarnate. So you know how today in the so-called black church, you'll go in the black community and you'll see, on the church signs, and it may say things like Jesus is Lord, or, basically certain phrases and statements that make Jesus synonymous with God Most High. And I can remember when I was a very young, teenager and a young boy, when I would go to church, even I would get confused by that. I would say, well, wait a minute, how could Jesus actually be God? I would always think that if God is the creator of all things and God is a spirit and can't be seen, how could Jesus be God when Jesus actually is a man who was a prophet or a leader or a Messiah, the leader of the Israelites? How could he be God? That never made sense to me. And the cognitive dissonance didn't allow me to receive that. And obviously Arius was the same. But what ended up happening was that, these bishops of Rome, they won out. And their doctrine, it became the new wave, basically. So they started to express and export the idea that Jesus, the Son of God, is equal to God. So that is why now today you have that in the so-called black church, because remember, us indigenous Americans, that's majority of our ethnic bloodline. But there is a small percentage of the melanated Europas, the tribes of Europa, that came over and intermarried into our families. So some of us that started to, adopt Christianity, you actually began to adopt the form of Christianity that said that Jesus was the Son of God or God incarnate. This is why you have in Islam, a lot of the Muslims are under the impression, and they are under the knowledge that Jesus is a prophet, he's a Messiah, and he's a leader, but he's not God incarnate. So that is not something that's specific to Islam. You have certain Israelites that believe the same thing. Okay. But ultimately what happened throughout that Nicene Council, the people who, went against that, they were kicked out. Now let's read about one of the men who fought hard against, these bishops at the Nicene Council, who tried to say that Jesus was actually God incarnate. It is a man named Arius of Libya or Arius of Alexandria, and that is actually who you see on the screen in front of you right here. All right. So this is a picture of the original Arius, okay, who was present for the Council of Nicaea. And he basically was there trying to keep the religion as pure as possible and not confuse the people by saying that, no, that God the Father or the Most High is the highest, and that Jesus or Yahweh or Yeshua, the Messiah, the leader of Israel, the prophet, that he is a man and he was influenced by God the Father, but he is not God the Father. Okay. So it says that, so let's read about Arius. It says his teachings about the nature of the Godhead in Christianity, which emphasize God the Father's uniqueness and Christ's subordination under the Father, and his opposition to what would become the dominant Christology, made him a primary topic of the First Council of Nicaea, convened by Emperor Constantine the Great in 325. After the Roman emperors Licinius and Constantine legalized and formalized Christianity, Constantine sought to unify the newly recognized church and remove theological divisions. The Christian church was divided by disagreements on Christology, specifically about the nature of the relationship between the first and second persons of the Trinity. So then it goes on to say that Arius and Arianism profess that let me just reread this whole sentence. It says Homoousian Christians, I hope I pronounced that right, including Arius of Alexandria, used Arius and Arianism as epithets to describe those who disagreed with their doctrine of co-equal Trinitarianism, a Christology representing God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son as of one essence or co-eternal. So what you had is you had these bishops during the Nicene Council who began to include the principles of Mystery Babylon. They began to include the Trinity of the ancient Egyptians, or Mizraim, where Osiris or Osar, when he dies, he is resurrected through his son Horus or Heru. And the Father relives through the Son as basically the same person reincarnated or reborn. Okay. So that is actually where that concept comes from. It is an ancient concept. So the same concept that the bishops of Christianity applied to Jesus and so-called God, they got that from the ancient concept of Asar and Heru. All right. So this is what I mean by Mystery Babylon starting to be included into the religion. And you had a lot of people that were practicing Christianity that didn't agree with that. But those people actually were cast to the side, and we never got to hear about them in history because the dominant doctrine won out. So when people started to be converted into Christianity in the Americas, you were converted using the doctrine. The mercenaries that converted you from Europe, they were using the doctrine that Jesus actually is God. All right. And that's why a lot of the melanated people of the Americas believe that, those that do. And there's still a lot of us that actually believe that and are still under that mind control. OK. So the next thing that we want to do is pay attention to some of the deeper conflicts. So we already starting to see that there is a division in Christianity when it comes to, God the Father and the so-called Son of God. But the next division is going to come from the expansion of Christianity, or also known as the Great Schism of Christianity. And now now we're going to read about that. OK, now this information is coming from the National Geographic site, and you can just basically look up the Great Schism of 1054. OK, now something is very important I want you to keep in mind. All right. So the Nicene Council was in 325 AD. This is when Arius of Alexandria and, his contemporaries were going against that Babylonian doctrine of Jesus actually being God. Now, that happened in about 325 AD. So about 700 plus years later, Remember, you starting to have these problems because it didn't stop in 300 AD. So from 300 AD, 400 AD, 500 AD, 600 AD, 700 AD, 800 AD, 900 AD, 1000 AD, through all these periods, you having these conflicts between Christendom and how they, want to practice the religion. All right. And this led to the great schism that happened in 1054 AD. Now, let's read about that. So it says the expansion of Christianity. The great schism split the main faction of Christianity into two divisions, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Today, they remain the two largest denominations of Christianity. Let me repeat that. The great schism split the main faction of Christianity into two divisions, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Today, they remain the two largest denominations of Christianity. So this is why I say that, those Christian mercenaries that came from Europe, they were coming from Western Christianity or from one of the branches of Roman Catholicism. Because believe it or not, I don't care if you call yourself a Protestant, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, all those other denominations, those are all under Roman Catholicism or Western Christianity, okay, under the Pope. And this is why the Pope has so much, that's why the Pope is revered so much throughout Western Europe and the United States, okay? That's because all the branches of Christianity are under Roman Catholicism, believe it or not. If your Christianity observes the Sabbath as Sunday, you actually are a Roman Catholic. You just call yourself a Presbyterian. You may just call yourself a Protestant, but you actually are under Roman Catholicism, all right? Even when you think about the Protestant Reformation, what were they trying to break off against? Roman Catholicism. All right. So this is why you got so many divisions. So let's continue. On July 16th, 1054, Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, was excommunicated from the Christian church based in Rome, Italy. Cerularius's excommunication was a breaking point and long rising tensions between the Roman church based in Rome and the Byzantine church based in Constantinople, now called Istanbul. The resulting split divided the European Christian church into two major branches, the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This split is known as the Great Schism, or sometimes the East-West Schism, or the Schism of 1054. All right. So about 700 years after the Nicene Council, you had a break or a divide between the Western Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church. All right. This is actually the beginning of this conflict that you currently or presently see today as the Ukrainians and NATO versus Russia, but it's really just Western Christianity versus Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire Christianity. All right. Only thing is now is that in the Western European Christianity, through Rome via the Pope, you also now have the Zionist influence because now they have the co-conspirators who, actually betrayed the Israelite leadership and were working with the, we'll say, aristocracy of Rome. So you had the rabbis, the dirty rabbis of Judea, working with the Roman military and the Roman aristocrats to actually take down this Israelite prophet or leader that we know of in the New Testament as so-called Jesus. Okay. So when you have that marriage between those dirty rabbis and those aristocrats of Rome, this is actually what I'll call the baby that was later on matured into what we'll call Zionism of the Zionist Christians and the Zionist Jews today. Because think about it. Have you all noticed that in Western Europe and the United States of America, that they always associate Christianity with the Judaism? They call it Judeo-Christianity. What Jews do you think that these Christians in Western Europe or Rome were affiliating themselves with. These dirty rabbis were affiliating themselves with those Roman aristocrats that wanted to snuff out that Israelite that was starting to raise a lot of hell and raise a lot of, turmoil and problems for them, okay? That we know of as so-called Jesus Christ. And those dirty Jews, those dirty rabbis, and those dirty Romans that went against him, the descendants of that is what we call today the Zionist Christians and the Zionist so-called Jews, the Zionist Israeli Jews. All right. So that's what Zionism is, believe it or not. And Zionism is actually behind what we know of as NATO. Okay. Let's continue. The Great Schism came about due to a complex mix of religious disagreements and political conflicts. What do you think that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is about? Economics, religious disagreements, and political conflicts. One of the many religious disagreements between the Western Roman and Eastern Byzantine branches of the church had to do with whether or not it was acceptable to use unleavened bread for the sacrament of communion. The West supported the practice while the East did not. Other objects of religious dispute include the exact wording of the Nicene Creed and the Western belief that clerics should remain celibate. So you can see all these conflicts that came. So first it may have started with, is God the Father equal to God the Son? They couldn't agree to that. And then it was other things they couldn't agree on. Another example was, is unleavened bread, acceptable for the sacrament of communion, or is it not acceptable? Should the clerics of the church remain celibate, or are they allowed to marry and procreate? These were a lot of the different conflicts that started to arise. And at some point in 1054, they broke off. All right. These religious disagreements were made worse by a variety of political conflicts, particularly regarding the power of Rome. Rome believed that the Pope, the religious leader of the Western Church, should have authority over the Patriarch, the religious authority of the Eastern Church. Constantinople disagreed. Each church recognized their own leaders, and when the Western Church eventually excommunicated Michael Cerularius and the entire Eastern Church. The Eastern Church retaliated by excommunicating the Roman Pope Leo III and the Roman Church with him. While the two churches have never reunited over 1,000 years after their split, the Western and Eastern branches of Christianity came to more peaceable terms. But, as I said, later on, you had NATO. Then you also had the Holy Crusades and a bunch of craziness. All right. So before we wrap up the Great Schism, I just want you to understand that you had this beef. And also one of the problems was that the Pope of Rome, or the Pope of Western Europe, the Pope of Italy, he thought that he would be able to have power over the Holy Roman Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And they said, fuck no. You know what I'm saying? You're not going to do that. Like, you're a religious leader over in Western Europe. You do your thing over there. But we over here in the Byzantine Empire, I'm the Holy Roman Emperor, and I'm running things over here. So that was also a conflict and a problem. All right. So you would always have the problem, not only in this situation, but even in Western Europe. You have these problems where the Pope would start to, gain so much power to where these different kings of Europe now were in conflict with the Pope. All right. So the next thing that I want to talk about is an event that we all have heard of called the Holy Crusades. All right. So we remember in the 300s AD, you had the Nicene Council where these debates were first introduced. Then after the Nicene Council, about 700 years later, you have the Great Schism, which totally divides Eastern European Christianity and Western European Christianity. And this was in 1054. Just a couple of decades later, the Pope in Western Christianity would up the ante to the next level and go into religious warfare. Because not only was it the Pope, but some of the other melanated families of Europa that were ruling in the West, that were ruling in Western Christianity, and they were part of Western Christendom. They wanted to regain power and regain lands that they had that were ancestral lands, where they had ethnic national ties to that land that we call modern day Palestine or Canaan or so-called Israel in the Middle East. All right. So through a lot of propaganda, the Pope went on these, almost like a tour around Western Europe, where he would start to tell these elaborate stories and these, these mythological stories to the poor serfs of Europa and get them to actually fight for him in the Holy Crusades and go to the Holy Land and take the Holy Land back from the infidels. This is what the Pope started to preach all around Europa. So a lot of these poor serfs who had no money, who had no food, and who wanted a new life, they wanted something greater. They were inspired by these stories from the Pope. They were inspired by these stories coming from the melanated aristocrats and rulers of Western Europe. And the battery was put in their back, a sword was put in their hand, and they were sent to march across Western Europe, through Eastern Europe, and then down south into what we know of as the Levant, to take back the Holy Land, or take back what we know of as Jerusalem. Okay? So when you think about these poor Europeans coming to the Americas, and they wanted to, set up shop, and they called this a new land or the promised land or manifest destiny where they could start a whole new life. That was not the first time that was preached to them. They were also preached. That was preached to them too, a couple of hundred years before that during the Holy Crusades. And this is what inspired them to go into the Levant and try to take back Jerusalem. So in the mind of the poor European, the poor Slavic European, the poor serfs, they saw Jerusalem and America as the same place. Let me say that. Let me say that one more time. For those poor Slavic Europeans, during the time of 1000 AD, when they were told about Jerusalem and it being this land of milk and honey and this land of riches, they wanted to go there and create a new life for themselves. And later on, their descendants would get on boats and be shipped over and come into the American colonies and saw this place as a promised land and a land of opportunity and a land of milk and honey. So they saw this as New Jerusalem. That is why you will see the Americas associated with New Jerusalem. So the same way that the Holy Crusades was used to take Jerusalem in the Levant is the same way that the Holy Crusades was used to take Jerusalem in the Americas. Okay. So let's read this real quick. Basic information on the Holy Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religious wars initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Christian Latin Church in the medieval period. When I say the Christian Latin Church, I'm talking about the Pope and Rome, Italy. Okay. The best known of these military expeditions are those to the Holy Land in the period between 1095 and 1291 that were intended to conquer Jerusalem and its surrounding area from Muslim rule. Beginning with the First Crusade, which resulted in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, dozens of military campaigns were organized, providing a focal point of European history for centuries. Crusading declined rapidly after the 15th century. During the 15th century or the 1400s, what were the Europeans doing? They were now trying to expand into the Americas, right? So believe it or not, the Holy Crusades actually did not end. It's actually still going on to this day. The Holy Crusades went on into the period of the Americas. And then after that, the Holy Crusades continued on into what we know of as World War I, where Lord Rothschild made a deal with the British government to get land in modern day Palestine to create a nation for the Caucasian converts to Judaism. And through World War I, There was another Holy Crusades where the British government and the British military, with the help of certain, we'll say, Arab nations in the so-called Middle East, crippled what we know of as the remainder of the Ottoman Empire. And then now those lands were turned over to the modern day Israelis, the Caucasian Jewish converts. That is how they got the land. And the Holy Crusades must continue because the modern day Caucasian converts in the land of Palestine today, they must actually expand their borders of what they consider to be the kingdom of Israel. Okay. So that means that there will be more conflicts with the Islamic nations of the so-called Middle East and so-called East Africa, i.e. Egypt. So you're hearing it right here, that there will be great conflicts between the Caucasian Israelis and certain Islamic nations of the so-called Middle East and East Africa, or basically Egypt. And these will be continuing wars that are going to spawn from this Ukrainian-Russia war. Okay? So if you ever heard that term about World War III, that's basically what that is, okay? So real quick, it says that during these crusades that not only were these Western European Christians going to conquer Jerusalem from the so-called Muslims, or what they would call the infidel, but they also were going to war and killing a lot of the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire Christians in Eastern Europe. I'm going to pause and take a drink of water. I want you to think about that. So we're back. So yes, you had Christians fighting Christians during the Holy Crusades. Christians coming from Western Europe fighting against the Byzantine Empire. Now you got to remember, the reason why the Byzantine Empire eventually crumbled was because there was relentless attack coming from the Ottoman Empire and certain Muslims coming from the Levant and so-called Eastern Europe, North Africa, and also from brutal assaults and attacks from the Western European Christian under the Pope. And then you had some of the wild Mongoloid tribes coming from Asia Minor and Greater Asia via the Silk Road. And they also trampled upon the Byzantine Empire. Okay. So this was, part of that struggle and conflict that still is going on today that we call the Ukraine and Russia war. All right. So to conclude the video, now I will go into my own book, America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent, where we will read a little bit deeper about this conflict between the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is being represented by Russia today, and Western European Christianity, which is being represented by NATO, the United States, the Zionists, and their affiliates. And I'm starting on page 118 in my own book in chapter 9 called Exodus into the Deserts of Egypt. The religious conflicts, tyrannical feudal barons, and lack of food supply made many European Slavics pray for a new life and a new land. In church sessions, ignorant Christian boys and girls are told stories of baby Jesus and Easter, and a place flowing with milk and honey. Paolo Sarpi created a method of attaining power by religious warfare, playing two factions against each other based on their religious variations. Venetians, or Romans, only cared about money and Venice, so instigating a Holy Crusades would be ideal for 1, getting European Christian kings and Roman Catholic Church in debt, 2, illegally obtaining and stealing allodial titles from coveted lands of Hebrews, and 3, human sacrifices. A royal rumble between Hebrews/Muslims and Christians was going to be a new gladiator ring for Venetian, Roman, Italian entertainment. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I reaches out to Western Byzantium's Pope Urban II for support versus Muslims of the region. So in 1095, you had the Byzantium emperor reaching out to Pope Urban, who was in Western Europe, for support versus some of those Muslims that were attacking them in the East. Pope Urban II and Western Christians were not the same culturally as Orthodox Byzantine, and this cry for help was a chance to get political sway in the East for Urban II. The ignorant, poor serf class was preached to about abundance and a potential rapture from God if they were to reconquer Jerusalem in the name of white Jesus. Fairy tales, mythologies, and folklore were the only education satanic feudal lords allowed, and this subconscious programming would trigger when Christian mercenaries went on hoorah tangents. Tens of thousands of military volunteers and families joined the Pope's political campaign for the long journey to Jerusalem. Throughout Europe, knighted mercenaries brutalized the church, so the Pope convinces them that fighting in the Crusades would cleanse them of sins. As if for a concert, Urban II promoted and marketed the Crusades as the apocalypse of Revelations. So what you had this Pope Urban II, who was having, he was, for one day, they would fear the Knights Templars, because the Knights Templars, they were a military extension of the church, but they had their own resources and they had their own thing going on. And there were times where if the king of some European nation wasn't right, or even if the Pope wasn't right, they would go against them. So the Pope needed to get them off his ass. So what he would do was basically put the battery in their back so they were fighting the Crusades for the Holy Land. And he went on this elaborate campaign all around Europa, talking to the poor serf class of Europe and giving them these stories about Jerusalem being this land of milk and honey. And if they go there, they'll be given all these riches and all this glory. And this what made them want to go down there and fight. Okay? Just like how they did 9/11. And they told everybody that we're going to fight against terrorism and we're going to go against the evil infidel. That was the Holy Crusades. We're still in the Holy Crusades. George Bush in the early 2000s would use the term crusades when he would talk about the war in Afghanistan. We're still in it. The Crusades is actually what's going against the so-called Aboriginal American. Yes, that's why we don't know who our people are. That's why we call ourselves Black and African American and all that same bullshit. All this is still part of the Holy Crusades. It never ended. All right. So ultimately what happened is that the Pope and his Slavic, warriors, the Knights Templars and, other people that were involved, they started to travel through Western Europe and they went into Eastern Europe. And instead of helping the Byzantine Empire, who were actually their Christian brothers, they subdued them. They killed a lot of them. They took their resources and they took their lands and their kingdoms from them, believe it or not, some of them. So this is, part of the problem. So they don't let you know that in the Holy Crusades, it wasn't just Christians fighting Muslims. It was also Christians fighting Christians. Western Europe fighting against the Byzantine Empire. Okay. So today, that is what you have going on. All right. The modern day state of Ukraine, they are in league with NATO, the United States, the Zionists, and the Christians of Western Europe. Mystery Babylon, NATO, they are in league with them. And that's why you see Russia going against that, because Russia represents the modern day Byzantine Empire of Moscow, Russia, which was Constantinople. But, we know that the Ottoman Empire changed it into Istanbul. And they even took the Hagia Sophia actually and converted that into a mosque, I believe. But don't be surprised that if some point in history, in the future, that Istanbul may go back to being a Byzantine Christendom empire. All right, after some of these great conflicts. So we just wanted to go over a history lesson so you'll understand the geopolitical climate and you just understand a little bit more about why does Eastern Europe and Western Europe not get along? AKA, why does the United States and these Judeo-Christians of Western Europe, why do they seem to look at Russia as this boogeyman? Why is Russia always used in our entertainment as the enemy? Whether it's the James Bond movie called GoldenEye, when he went against the Russians in that, whether it's Rambo, or all these other movies, whether it's The Equalizer with Denzel Washington, and he's going against the Russian mob. Why are the Russians always used as this enemy in Western European, Caucasian, Christian entertainment and propaganda? Because it stems from this old conflict going back to the schism of 1095 or 1054, excuse me. It extends from this conflict going back to 1095 in the Holy Crusades. It extends back to the conflict going back to the Nicene Council in the 300s AD. All right. So hopefully this makes some sense and you have some enlightenment on this subject. Stay tuned. We out.